Hi, I am Ajit Lenin. Welcome to the Enterprise Architecture video series, part 14. We are looking at the six-layer framework to establish enterprise architecture practices, and we are at the architecture domains, and under the architecture domains, we are at the information architecture. So as I explained in the previous video, I'm looking information architecture slightly different in the way TOGAF defines it. So there are four components we looked at in the last video: IT capabilities, services, business objects, and policy objects. So business objects and policy objects would be the focus for this video, and the next video will move into the next component set of components. Right? So let's look at business objects first, right? So what are business objects? In my view, it is basically a logical representation of business entities and the related behaviors, which we can use it to implement the corresponding data models, methods, functions, etc. on our actual implementation, right? So why is it important, right? So this is basically bringing the business entities, which are only the structural aspects, and the business functions, which are related to the business entities, which are kind of spread across in multiple business functions across processes, services, right? So bringing them together into a business object, we'll see how it helps it, but it's an important aspect, in my view, as part of the enterprise architecture practice to bring them together into an component called business object. Basically, it brings the structural and the behavioral aspects related to that business entity, right? I just listed out some of the common business objects that are found across the industries, right? It could be accounts, where accounts are there everywhere: accounts, customer, contact, ticket, price, contract, usage. All these are different sets of business objects that we see across multiple industries. Now let's see how we can use this business object, right? How this can be used, right? So business objects helps us in defining the application landscape or the scope of the application, right? This is a very important aspect. As I explained, the key aspect of business object is it brings in the structural aspects of the business entity along with the behavioral aspects which is spread across business functions that could be across processes or across business services, etc. Bring them together into a common component, right? That helps us to define the scope of an application, right? Typically, we would like to have a single application manage the business object as a whole, right? The business object should be managed within a business object. That way, there is a single governance source for the business object. That way, we get to implement the structural aspects as well as the behavior related to that business object in the same application. This is very important. Without this exercise, right? Typically, when we go with the traditional way of building a business architecture and then going into the application architecture, that connect or the traceability would be missing, right? So we might end up having, we may not be knowing there is a business function connected to that entity, and we might implement that business function somewhere else, whereas the application that manages the business entity could be somewhere else. So bringing them together into a structure called or a component called business object helps us in that aspect of defining the scope of the application and which drives the application landscape itself, right? And business objects helps us in deriving the data model, right? So the structural aspect of the entities which comes into business object automatically moves towards defining the data model that implements that business object. Similarly, it helps in defining the if it's we are looking like we are going to use an object-oriented language like Java or Python. It helps us implementing the classes and methods, etc. Right. So that's the benefits of using a business object. Right. Now let's quickly look at the characteristics of business objects. Right. So business objects represents both structural and behavioral aspects, right? We talked about that. So for example, a contract can have attributes like terms, expiry date, etc. And it will have behavioral aspects also like extending the contract, terminating the contract, etc. Right? Those are the behavioral aspects. So both functions should come together. Business objects can have relationship with other business objects. An order can have an appointment that can be assigned to a resource. All typical information model relationships is possible here. Business object can be abstracted, extended, or specialized. So basic inheritance that's applied here. business objects can be associated to one or more policy objects. So we'll come to what is a policy object, but business objects can have associations with policy objects. For example, a business object can have a set of validations rules which can be abstracted into a policy object, right? Similarly, there could be specific kind of policies that is related that can be related to the business object, but can be a cross business object, which is part of a process, right? So that also could be a policy object. We'll come to that. Business objects are pretty much persisted because there's a structural aspect to it. They are persisted, but we should be able to derive light business objects from the business objects, which can be used to provide different views to different clients or different other applications, basically, right? So it drives the usages. So, for example, if I have an order, right, I can provide an order summary light object, which can probably can be used in the front end systems to display the summary of an order to a user, right? So there can be a light object implementation, but the base business object is a persistable object beyond which we can create the light objects, right? So that's one of the another benefit of bringing a business object, where we can define what are the different ways this business objects could be used and what are the light objects that we can derive from it, right? And why do we need to derive that by light objects, right? So one of the fundamental things I believe would help in architecting or building a good enterprise architecture is the ability to standardize our APIs, right? In today's world, everything is APIs, right? So APIs should use, if you follow simple principle of APIs using just the business objects to talk to each other, right? The payload should contain only business objects or policy objects. We'll come to that. Instead of two applications deciding on an interface, right? While building an API, it will end up using a lot of internal, exposing a lot of internal components or structures to the external world, right? Whereas we strictly stop the APIs to be at a business object level, right? We'll know the applications are talking only at a business level, right? That way improves the flexibility of the architecture. We'll see how that's can be done. So for example, a bill summary should use the invoice object, right? So rather than gathering some set of attributes here and there and putting up an API interface, if we have a clearly defined business object or a light object or a policy object, that we can build API interfaces using those, right? So that becomes helps us in building a flexible architecture. Let's quickly look at policy objects, right? What are policy objects? Policy objects are basically abstractions of policies or rules, right? Whatever it could be. It could be related to a process. It could be a process controlling rule or a access policy or a validation rule, etc. So if we can abstract those policies and rules into captured in the business architecture into a policy object, which is a behavioral object, right? It doesn't have a structural aspect to it, right? Policy objects basically helps in agile building agile architecture, right? So how does it help, right? When I say here I have a business function, right, or validation function as defined as part of the business architecture, and there could be multiple similar functions across different processes. So if I can abstract them into a single policy object, right, that helps us in defining an application or a component of application that is going to manage that policy object, and we can actually empower the business to manage the policy object, right? So it could be reference data or whatever way you implement it. It helps us in identifying what can we give the ability to the business to manage themselves, right? Rather than them coming to IT for making changes, right? Policy objects holds the specifications. So this is a new term I'm introducing called specification. Policy, though I said it's a behavioral object, it can have data also, right? In a way that I'm not calling it attributes because these are not persistible data. This is reference data. So the policies, whatever rules that is captured in the business requirements can be abstracted. When you abstract into a policy object, we can create specifications which would drive, or reference data that could drive the policies, right? So that helps us in identifying what is the reference data we need and which needs to be managed by business, right? And also, I talked earlier, APIs can use policy objects as well as part of the payload, right? It could be APIs that is managing the policies, or those policy APIs that is supporting a process that uses the policy, right? So it can be part of the payload, right? Then we'll quickly summarize on why we need business objects and policy objects. I touched upon it couple of slides back, but we'll summarize it and see how a practice of bringing business object and policy object helps us in the whole and managing a good enterprise architecture, right? One key thing is it facilitates the traceability from business architecture to the application architecture. So today, one of the big problems is we have the business architecture, which is represented in processes, functions, or business entities, and application architecture, which is represented in applications, data objects, or a data model, or some flows, right, or APIs, right? Most of the time there won't be a traceability between this, right? So it is very hard for a business, when a business process changes or a business entity changes, to trace it back to which applications are impacted by that, right? And also when an application goes through modernization, say we are changing the technology of an application, moving from one to another, right? It is very hard to derive what are the business functions or processes that are impacted by that, right? So to help the testing out or assessing the impact, right? So those are the areas where the business object is going to help us, right? Basically, for example, say account as a business entity, right? There could be an financial account, sales account, or service account. But we should be able to bring the abstraction together into an entity called account. And we should be able to have an application that manages account, whether it's a sales account, business account, finance account, or a service account. Otherwise, these three entities could end up in three different applications, which basically would end up, one is it avoids the reusability abstraction capabilities, and also the duplication of the code could happen, right? And for each, by building that business object, it provides us a traceability, whether it's a sales account, financial account, or service account, all maps to a business object called account, right? Which brings a traceability, and we can look at which application is implementing that account function, right? Account object and the functions. So traceability is one big aspect, which would be a real help, right? This is a real problem statement I think every organization is facing. It drives agility in multiple ways. So it drives agility on the policy object side. It by abstracting the rules or the process the specifications into policy objects helps us defining the specifications, right? And identify the reference data that we need to give control back to the business so they can manage the policies by themselves, right? That helps in the agility. The other aspect is the abstraction aspect. When the business object perspective, we should be able to abstract. So business entities, when we define business processes, there could be similar entities that could exist across business processes or across business functions that touches those business entities, right? If we implement process by process independent, we might end up in duplicating the capabilities, right? Rather, if we bring into an abstraction of business object, for example, right, I have a sales order and a service order, right? If I not looking at sales order as separate implementation, service order as a separate implementation, because these are two separate processes, right? I will be duplicating a lot of functions out there, right? So instead, if I can abstract them into an order business object and implement that order business object in a single application, right? I'll have a lot of reusability coming in, and then that drives the agility aspect, right? So the whole reusability aspect, which drives agility. The other aspect is flexibility, right? The same abstraction helps us in the flexibility. So how does abstraction helps in flexibility? Because abstraction helps us to look for changes, right? So a business architecture, competence on the business architecture, once it's abstracted, helps us a bigger or a higher, helps us in implementing a higher level function, so that any changes in the business architecture need not reflect in its system change, right? So it's typical benefit that comes out of abstraction. The other key benefit is the standardization of interfaces, right? As I explained earlier, rather than defining the interfaces between applications, right? We follow a principle of the interface between the applications would be only, they will only talk the language of business objects or policy objects. It standardizes the languages, and then automatically brings in the flexibility out of it. It drives agility and flexibility, right? Now, quickly look at summarize it into a meta model, right? Both on the business object and the policy object. I captured in a single diagram because both are related. The business object, if you look at it, it can be associated with other business objects. It can extend business object can basically have the inheritance capability, right? Object can be extended or specialized. Business objects have attributes, which is a structural aspect, and business objects have functions, which is the behavioral aspect. Business objects uses policy object. It could be a number of policy objects, right? We also looked at business or light objects could be derived out of business objects, right? Coming to policy objects have specification. Again, just to stress that I'm not calling it attributes because it is not, policy objects are not persistible objects, these are behavioral objects. Specification is a abstraction of the policy or the rule into more like a defining it, what reference data could help us in implementing the policy, right? And policy objects have, of course, have the function because it is a behavioral element. And policy object can extend or specialize, right? We can go through the inheritance as well. Coming to APIs, so APIs can use business objects, policy object, or the light business objects, so that the whole API interfaces, the interfaces could be standardized, right? So let me summarize. So to summarize, we have looked at business objects, how we can be used, the characteristics of business objects. We looked at policy object and benefits of business object and policy object, why we need to use them. And finally, the meta model that defines the business and policy objects. In the next video, we will look at the other two components of the information architecture, the IT capabilities and services. Thank you.